In this lesson, we will examine the call of Moses in Exodus chapters 3 and 4. But first, a little background. The book of Genesis closes with Joseph and his family living in the land of Goshen in the eastern Nile Delta. This is the same region where Ramses I built a new capital city that he called Per-Rameses, the city of Ramses in Egyptian. In the Bible, this city is simply called Ramses. It is here in this marshy region that Moses was born and set aloft in a basket on the Nile River. Moses might have been placed into a burial basket like this one in the photo in order to hide him from Pharaoh, who wanted to kill all Hebrew baby boys. Interestingly, the biblical writer did not use the Hebrew word for basket, sal, even though this is how the word is often translated into English, but rather tevach, literally a box, but used in the Bible to refer to Noah's Ark. The biblical writer deliberately used the Hebrew word for ark, tevach, in order to make the connection in the reader's mind between God's saving of Noah in the great flood and the saving of Moses. Later, when Moses is grown, he kills an Egyptian taskmaster who was abusing a Hebrew slave, and so Moses must flee for his life. According to Exodus 2:15, Moses headed for Midian in the region of southern Jordan and northern Saudi Arabia. While no details are given, Moses had to journey 250 miles across the harsh Sinai desert to reach Midian. It is while Moses is in Midian that we learn that the Pharaoh has died and that God has heard the Israelites, remembered his covenant with the ancestors, and taken notice of their plight. You will recall that when we learned about Noah's curse of Canaan, that God had forewarned Abram that centuries later his offspring would be oppressed by a foreign nation for 400 years until it was time for God to bring judgment on the Amorites. Well, that time has finally come. While he was in Midian, God revealed himself to Moses, and the drama unfolds in 3 acts. First, God calls Moses while he is tending his father-in-law's sheep and goats. While wandering with the flocks, Moses arrives at the mountain of God, called Mount Horeb, both here and in the book of Deuteronomy, but Mount Sinai elsewhere, including Exodus 19, where Israel will receive the 10 Commandments. Thus, 2 different names for the same mountain. At the mountain of God, Moses sees a bush on fire, but not consumed, and goes over to investigate. Most movies focus on God's voice calling to Moses out of the burning bush. What they do not note is that according to verse 2, Yahweh does not appear directly to Moses, but indirectly in the form of a divine being. Only in verse 4 does God call out to Moses from inside the bush. God cloaking himself in fire, smoke, and other natural phenomena is what scholars call a theophany, literally, manifestation of God. You must know this term for the quiz because it is used a lot in biblical studies. God then tells Moses he is aware of what the people are going through and that God had not forgotten or abandoned his people. God does so through a series of 6 verbs, which in Jewish tradition is called the 6 attributes of God. First, God sees. Then God hears. Then God knows. God comes down. God delivers. And God brings up. One of the biggest challenges of faith that Israel faced, and that we continue to face today, is to be patient when God is silent and to remain steadfast in the belief that God knows and cares about our situation. Pharaoh's daughter, who rescued the baby Moses from the Nile, models some of these same attributes. Like God, she heard Moses crying, came down to the riverside, saw Moses, brought his basket out of the water, and took pity on him. This is deliberate on part of the biblical writer. In contrast to her tyrannical father, the biblical writer wants us to see Pharaoh's daughter as an exemplar of God. Our God is not one who loves abstractly, but loves through meaningful action. God now calls Moses to confront Pharaoh and demand that he let God's people go. However, Moses lists 4 objections. The first is, "Who am I that I should go to Pharaoh? I am not a powerful or influential person." Moses, however, is not the only one to refuse or challenge God's call. Other famous biblical figures did the same. Jonah was one, and remember, he ended up getting swallowed by a large fish. The prophet Jeremiah is another. Clearly, in the case of Moses, it was not easy to be called by God and then to confront the most powerful man on earth. Moses then objects that the people will not believe in his commission to go before Pharaoh and will want to know the name of the deity that sent him. So God identifies himself by a 4-letter name, Yod-He-Vav-He in Hebrew. This is how God's name looks in ancient Hebrew script. This is how the name looked in the writing of Jesus' day and still in use today. This divine name, often referred to as God's personal name or covenant name, was pronounced something like Yahweh. Out of respect for the divine name, Jewish tradition substitutes Yahweh for Lord in all capital letters and says Adonai instead of Yahweh. The ancient scroll to the left is an actual Hebrew prayer called the priestly benediction, etched onto a small silver scroll that was rolled up and worn around the neck. The scroll dates to the time of King Josiah in the late 7th century BCE and also appears in Numbers 6:24. It reads, "May Yahweh, or Adonai, bless you and keep you. May Yahweh make his face to shine upon you and be gracious to you. May Yahweh lift up his countenance upon you and give you peace." So what does Yahweh mean? The name is based on the verb to be. Through his name, God is simply saying that he exists. In responding to Moses, God first says, Ehyeh asher ehyeh, I am who I am, or I will be who I will be. Either translation is possible. In fact, one can read these 3 words as follows: I am who I am who I will be who I am. Such is God's character, eternally present. God then tells Moses, "Tell the people that Ehyeh, I am, or I will be, has sent you to confront Pharaoh." Finally, God says that his name is Yahweh, meaning he is, he will be, or even he who causes to be. Note what is happening here. When God speaks about himself, God speaks in the first person and says, I am. These are the very same words that Jesus used before the high priest when Jesus was on trial before the Sanhedrin. This is why Caiaphas declared Jesus' I am statement as blasphemous. By contrast, when we speak of God, we refer to him in the third person as he is, in other words, Yahweh. Moses is worried that the people will not listen to him, so God gives 2 signs that will make the people realize that God has indeed sent Moses. The first sign is for Moses to throw down his staff so it becomes a snake. The second sign is that if Moses puts his hand inside his garment, it will come out leprous. But put it back in again, and it will come out whole. If the first two signs didn't work, then God would provide a third sign, which would be to pour out water from the Nile River on dry ground and it become blood. As we see at the end of chapter 4, Moses performed these signs before the people and they believed him. Pharaoh, however, did not. Pharaoh not only rejected the first two signs, but the third sign of the Nile River turning into blood will become the first of 10 plagues that God will bring upon Pharaoh and the Egyptian people for their stubborn refusal to let Israel go. Finally, Moses tells God that he is not a good speaker. We don't know if this was because Moses had a speech impediment or simply lacked confidence. Either way, God tells him that he will send Moses' brother Aaron with him. Thus, God will tell Moses what to say, who will turn and tell Aaron, who will then tell Pharaoh. The theology of this passage is clear. God will use the weak, Moses, to shame the strong, Pharaoh. In this manner, God's name will be known among the nations. This concludes our lesson on the call of Moses.